Welcome to UFO to UAP. I'm your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we're going back to the Roswell story after newly released Army Air Force documents reveal something really interesting about flying saucers. Thank you if you're already a subscriber. If you're not, please hit that subscribe button and also share the episode on social media to help extend our reach. What if I told you that only weeks after the Roswell incident, senior Army Air Force officers were circulating classified memoranda stating that flying saucers were something real and not visionary or fictitious? Not a journalist, not a civilian witness, not a UFO researcher. The United States Army Air Forces. For decades, Roswell has been portrayed as a debate between extraordinary claims and official explanations. On one side, those who believe something extraordinary crashed in the New Mexico desert. On the other, those who argue the incident was explained by weather balloons, Project Mogul, and Cold War secrecy. But recently surfaced documents force us to examine a different question. Not what modern researchers think, not what television documentaries claim, not what internet debates conclude. Instead, what did the United States military actually believe in the months immediately following Roswell? Because the answer may surprise you. Tonight, we examine a series of 1947 Army Air Force documents discussing what officials called flying saucer phenomena. These documents do not prove extraterrestrial visitation. They do not confirm crashed alien spacecraft, but they do reveal something significant. Senior military officials were taking the reports seriously, far more seriously than many people realize. And nearly 80 years later, those records continue to raise important questions about one of the most famous mysteries in modern history. To understand these documents, we need to return to the summer of 1947. Roswell occurred in July. The famous press release announcing the recovery of a flying disc was issued on July 8. The retraction followed quickly. The weather balloon explanation entered the public narrative. For many Americans, the story seemed finished. But behind closed doors, military interest in flying saucer reports was only beginning. One of the most remarkable document dates from August 22nd, 1947. The subject line reads, "Flying Saucer Phenomena." The document was circulated through Army Air Force intelligence channels. What makes this memorandum extraordinary is not speculation, it is the language. Officials wrote that a detailed study of selected reports revealed common patterns among observations. They were attempting to identify reoccurring characteristics, patterns, consistency, reliability. In other words, they were treating the reports as an intelligence problem. The document then lists specific characteristics repeatedly reported by observers. The reported objects were described as having metallic surfaces. Witness described circular or elliptical shapes, flat on the bottom, slightly domed on top. Reports place some objects near the size of a large military aircraft. Others described formations of multiple objects traveling together. Several reports estimated speeds above 300 knots. These descriptions are striking because they appear months after Roswell and are being discussed within official military channels. Even more interesting is another section of the memorandum. Officials sought assurance that no known Army Air Forces project possessed these characteristics. That request suggests investigators were actively attempting to determine whether the reports could be explained by existing American technology. The implication is important. Military analysts were not immediately concluding the objects were extraterrestrial. They're attempting to eliminate conventional explanations first. That is precisely what modern investigators would do today. And then we encounter another remarkable document, dated September 23rd, 1947, originating from Air Materiel Command at Wright Field. The subject, AMC Opinion Concerning Flying Discs. This document contains one of the most frequently cited statements in the history of government UFO records. It states, "The phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious." Think about that for a moment. The statement is not saying extraterrestrial. It is not saying alien. It is not claiming crashed spacecraft, but it is saying something important. Military analysts believe witnesses were observing something real, something worthy of investigation, something not simply dismissed as imagination or mass hysteria. The document continues. Officials describe reports of metallic or light reflecting surfaces, circular or elliptical shapes, high maneuverability, formation flying, flight characteristics that appeared unusual for known aircraft of the era. The memorandum even discusses the possibility that some objects might be controlled manually, automatically, or remotely. Remember the year, 1947, long before modern drones, long before autonomous aircraft, long before advanced computer systems. Military analysts were attempting to understand reports that appeared inconsistent with known aviation capabilities. This does not mean they concluded the objects represented revolutionary technology. It means they were considering possibilities. And that distinction matters because serious investigations begin with questions, not conclusions. If the September 1947 Air Material Command Memorandum is remarkable for its conclusion that the phenomenon was something real and not visionary or fictitious, what follows may be even more revealing, because the authors did not stop at describing the reported characteristics. They attempted to explain them, and in doing so, they exposed the limits of what military analysts believed was possible at the time. The memorandum lists several recurring observations collected from multiple reports. The objects were frequently described as metallic or highly reflective. Witnesses consistently reported circular or elliptical shapes. Many accounts described a domed upper section and a flatter underside. Reports suggested formation flying involving groups of objects rather than isolated incidents. And perhaps most importantly, investigators noted flight characteristics that appeared unusual compared with known aircraft technology. And this is where the document becomes especially interesting. The analysts acknowledged that some reported performance characteristics might potentially be achievable, in theory, but only through an extensive and highly advanced development effort. The report specifically discusses the possibility of constructing an aircraft capable of the described general characteristics. Yet even this theoretical assessment came with significant caveats. Such a project would be extremely expensive, technically challenging, time-consuming, and beyond the scope of known existing programs. In other words, investigators were not simply dismissing the reports, they were attempting to determine whether the observations would be reconciled with known aerospace engineering. This is a crucial distinction. The document does not claim the objects were extraterrestrial. It does not claim they were advanced American technology. It does not claim they originated from a foreign power. Instead, it openly evaluates possibilities, and in doing so, reveals the uncertainty facing military intelligence in 1947. Perhaps the most revealing section appears later in the memorandum. The authors considered three potential explanations. The first possibility was that the objects were domestic in origin, a secret American project unknown to the investigators themselves. This concern appears repeatedly throughout the 1947 correspondence. Officials wanted to know whether another branch of government possessed a classified program matching the reported characteristics. The second possibility involved the complete absence of physical evidence. The memorandum specifically notes the lack of recovered exhibits that would undeniably prove the existence of the reported objects. That sentence is fascinating because it reveals a tension that still exists in UAP research today. Witnesses may report extraordinary observations, radar may detect anomalies, pilots may provide testimony, but without physical evidence, uncertainty remains. This challenge has followed the phenomenon for nearly 8 decades. The third possibility raised by the report was equally significant. The analysts considered whether a foreign nation might possess advanced propulsion technology beyond American knowledge. Remember the geopolitical environment of 1947. The Second World War had ended only 2 years earlier. The Cold War was emerging. American intelligence agencies were increasingly concerned about Soviet technological advances. Military planners could not simply assume that every unusual observation represented a misunderstanding. National security demanded that unfamiliar aerial phenomena be investigated seriously, and this concern leads directly to one of the most important recommendations contained within the document. The authors proposed a detailed classified study. Not a public study, not a media campaign, a classified investigation. The recommendation called for the collection and analysis of all available information: Army data, Navy data, Atomic Energy Commission data, scientific information, and any additional reports relevant to the phenomenon. The proposal envisioned a coordinated effort involving military, scientific, and intelligence communities. When modern audiences hear discussions about Project Blue Book, the UAP Task Force, or ARROW, they often assume government interest in the phenomenon began much later. These documents suggest otherwise. The military was already discussing formal investigative structures in 1947. The language is remarkably familiar. Collect data, evaluate reports, compare observations, eliminate conventional explanations, identify patterns, assess national security implications. The methodology is surprisingly modern, only the technology has changed. Today, investigators have satellites, advanced radar systems, artificial intelligence, infrared sensors, and global communication networks. The analysts of 1947 possessed far fewer tools, yet they were attempting to answer many of the same questions. What are people observing? Are the reports credible? Can known technology explain them? Do they represent a security concern? And perhaps most importantly, what evidence is required before extraordinary conclusions can be reached? This is where another document becomes particularly significant: a routing and record sheet signed by Major General Curtis E. L. May. L. May would later become one of the most influential military leaders in American history. The document appears to respond directly to concerns raised by investigators. Its conclusion is concise. The Army Air Forces had no research project matching the characteristics described in the reports. The statement deserves careful examination. It does not prove the reports were accurate. It does not prove unknown technology existed, but it does indicate that the investigators were actively attempting to rule out known Air Force programs. And according to the document they found, no project matching the reported descriptions. Taken together, these records paint a picture very different from the popular stereotype often associated with 1947. The documents do not reveal military officials laughing at witnesses. They do not reveal immediate dismissal. They do not portray flying saucer reports as obvious nonsense. Instead, they reveal intelligence officers, engineers, and military leaders attempting to understand a phenomenon they considered worthy of serious attention. That does not make every report true, nor does it validate every extraordinary claim made since, but it does establish something important. The people closest to the intelligence process in 1947 were asking different questions, and they had not yet found satisfactory answers. The significance of these documents may not be what they prove, their significance may be what they reveal about the mindset of the investigators themselves. Because long before modern disclosure debates, long before congressional hearings, and long before the term UAP entered public vocabulary, military officials were already confronting a mystery that seemed to resist easy explanation. And the deeper they looked, the more questions appeared to emerge. At this point, an obvious question emerges. What do these documents have to do with Roswell? After all, the memoranda we've discussed were written in August and September of 1947. Roswell occurred in July. These documents do not explicitly state Roswell proves flying saucers, nor do they claim we've recovered an extraterrestrial craft. If that were the case, the mystery would have ended long ago. Instead, the connection is more subtle, and perhaps more important, because these records reveal the atmosphere inside the Army Air Forces immediately following the most famous UFO incident in history. To understand why that matters, consider the timeline. The Roswell press release was issued on July 8th, 1947. The famous flying disc announcement became national news. Within days, the story was reversed. The weather balloon explanation entered the public domain. But behind the scenes, reports of flying saucers were increasing across the United States. Military intelligence officials were collecting observations. Pilots were submitting reports. Radar operators were documenting unusual events. Commanders were asking questions. And by August, we find Army Air Forces personnel exchanging memoranda specifically dedicated to what they called flying saucer phenomena. That timing is difficult to ignore. Whether Roswell itself influenced these discussions cannot be stated with certainty. However, it is clear that the military's interest in the phenomenon had intensified. The documents demonstrate that by late summer 1947, flying saucers were no longer being treated as isolated newspaper stories. They had become an intelligence matter, a subject worthy of analysis, a potential national security concern. And that shift tells us something important about Roswell. The significance of Roswell may not be that it provided answers. Its significance may be that it accelerated questions. Questions that military investigators continued asking long after the headlines disappeared. One of the most fascinating aspects of these records is what they do not contain. They do not contain certainty. The analysts were not presenting final conclusions. They were presenting working assessments. The phenomenon appeared real. Reports shared common characteristics. Known projects did not seem to provide a complete explanation. Further investigation was required. That was the state of knowledge in 1947. In many ways, it remains the state of knowledge today. The terminology has changed. Flying saucers became UFOs. UFOs became UAP. The technology improved. The sensors improved, the investigative tools improved, yet the core challenge remains remarkably similar. Officials continue attempting to demonstrate whether unusual observations can be explained through conventional means. When explanations fail, further investigations follow. This continuity is one of the most striking aspects of the historical record. The questions being asked in 1947 are remarkably familiar. What are observers seeing? Are reports credible? Could advanced technology explain the observations? Could foreign adversaries possess unknown capabilities? What evidence exists? What evidence is missing? Those questions could easily appear in an Arrow briefing today, and that continuity suggests something larger. The modern UAP conversation did not begin with congressional hearings. It did not begin with the Nimitz encounter. It did not begin with whistleblowers. The route stretched back decades to intelligence officers reviewing reports, to engineers evaluating performance characteristics, to military leaders attempting to determine whether an emerging phenomenon represented a misunderstanding, a technological surprise, or something entirely unexpected. This brings us to perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the Roswell debate. Many discussions assume there are only two possibilities. Either Roswell was an extraterrestrial spacecraft, or Roswell was completely explained and therefore irrelevant. The historical documents suggest a more nuanced reality. Investigators often operate between certainty and ignorance. They work in an environment of incomplete information. They evaluate probabilities. They eliminate possibilities. They follow evidence where it leads. The Army Air Force's documents illustrate exactly that process. The analysts were not claiming certainty, they were acknowledging uncertainty. And acknowledging uncertainty is not a weakness, it is the foundation of investigation. Perhaps this is why these records remain so compelling nearly 80 years later. They allow us to observe the investigative process itself, not the mythology that emerged later, not the television specials, not the internet debates, the actual process. The military officers confronting reports they could not immediately explain, attempting to gather data, searching for patterns, considering possibilities, requesting additional information. In many ways, these documents humanize the story. They reveal investigators asking the same questions many people continue asking today. The mystery feels less like a battle between believers and skeptics, and more like a genuine effort to understand something poorly understood. That distinction matters, because when we read these documents carefully, we discover that the most fascinating story may not be whether flying saucers existed. The most fascinating story may be how institutions responded when confronted by uncertainty itself. Roswell became famous because people wanted answers. The documents became important because they reveal how investigators searched for those answers. And the search, it seems, was only just beginning. By the end of 1947, the Army Air Forces had not solved the mystery. They had not identified a definitive cause. They had not reached a final conclusion. What they had done was establish a framework for investigation, a framework that would evolve through Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, the UAP Task Force, Arrow, and every major government inquiry that followed. The modern UAP era did not emerge from nowhere. Its foundations can be seen in these very pages, typed in military offices, stamped restricted and secret, circulated among intelligence officers, and preserved long enough for us to examine them almost 8 decades later. The question is not whether these documents prove extraordinary claims, they do not. The question is what they reveal about the people investigating those claims, and the answer appears surprisingly clear. They were taking the phenomenon seriously. As we reach the end of this investigation, it's worth asking a simple question. Why do these documents matter in 2026? After all, they are nearly 80 years old. The officers who wrote them are gone. The world that produced them no longer exists. The Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force. The Cold War came and went. Technology transformed beyond anything those investigators could have imagined. So, why are researchers still examining these papers? The answer is because they provide something increasingly rare in the UAP conversation: a primary source, a direct window into what officials were thinking at the time. Not decades later, not through recollections, not through documentaries, not through internet commentary. The documents allow us to see the investigation while it was still unfolding, and what we find is surprisingly relevant to the modern UAP debate, because the same questions remain. When Arrow investigates a modern UAP report, what does it do? It collects data. It evaluates witness credibility. It examines sensor information. It compares observations against known technologies. It attempts to eliminate conventional explanations. That methodology is remarkably similar to what we see in 1947. The tools have changed. The process has not. This continuity tells us something important. The modern UAP discussion did not emerge suddenly. It is part of a much longer historical thread, a thread connecting Roswell to Project Sign, Project Sign to Project Grudge to Project Blue Book, Project Blue Book to the Pentagon's UAP Task Force, and ultimately to Arrow and the current disclosure era. The names changed, the agencies changed, but the fundamental challenge remained. How do you investigate reports that resist immediate explanation? These newly surfaced records also challenge a common misconception. Many people assume the government interest in UFOs began because officials believed they had discovered extraordinary evidence. The documents suggest something different. Interest emerged because officials could not confidently explain what they were observing, and that distinction matters. Investigation does not require certainty. Investigation begins when certainty is absent. The Army Air Forces document reveal exactly that condition: uncertainty, professional uncertainty, institutional uncertainty, not panic, not belief, not dismissal, investigation. And perhaps that is the most important lesson these records offer. For decades, the UAP debate has been framed as a conflict between believers and skeptics. Yet the documents reveal a third position: the position occupied by investigators, the willingness to acknowledge uncertainty while continuing to search for answers. That approach remains as relevant today as it was in 1947, because despite all the advances in technology, some mysteries remain. Today we possess surveillance satellites, global radar networks, infrared sensors, artificial intelligence, machine learning, massive intelligence databases. Yet governments around the world continue to encounter cases that remain unresolved, not because extraterrestrials have been proven, but because uncertainty still exists. The existence of unresolved cases is not evidence of extraordinary explanations. However, it is evidence that investigation remains necessary. And that is precisely the position these documents reveal. The officers who wrote them did not know what they were dealing with, but they believed the reports deserved attention. That alone is historically significant. Perhaps this is why Roswell continues to occupy such a unique position in history, not because it provides definitive answers, but because it marks the beginning of a conversation that continues today. A conversation about evidence, about technology, about national security, about transparency, and about humanity's ongoing attempt to understand phenomena that challenge existing assumptions. The newly released records do not prove or solve Roswell. They do not prove extraterrestrial visitation. They do not confirm crash retrieval programs. What they do provide is something arguably more valuable: context. They reveal how military investigators approached the problem in real time. They reveal what questions were being asked. They reveal what explanations were being considered. And they reveal that the phenomenon was taken seriously enough to warrant classified analysis at the highest levels of the Army Air Forces. For historians, that is important. For researchers, it is important. And for anyone interested in the origins of the modern UAP debate, it is essential. As we conclude, perhaps the most revealing sentence remains the one written nearly 8 decades ago. The phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Those words do not tell us what the phenomena is. They do not tell us where it came from. They do not tell us whether any extraordinary claims are true. But they do tell us that military investigators believe there was something worth investigating, and that may be the true legacy of these documents. Not answers, questions. Questions that have survived nearly 80 years. Questions that continue to drive investigations today. Questions that remain at the heart of the UFO and UAP mystery. Thank you for joining me in this episode of UFO to UAP. If you enjoyed this investigation, please follow the show, leave a review, and share the episode with others interested in Roswell, military history, government records, declassified documents, and the continuing search for answers. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are not what a document proves, they are what a document reveals about the people searching for the truth.